Welcome, and today we drift into the frozen wilderness of another time, a time when men battled not only the cold, but the very limits of human endurance. Before there were machines, before steel tamed the land, there were lumberjacks, raw, relentless, and unyielding. They carved their lives out of ice and pine, building bunkhouses deep in the heart of the northern forests, where winter never seemed to end. Tonight we'll step into their world, the biting cold, the smell of pine pitch, the laughter echoing through timber walls, and the silent strength of men who worked until their hands bled and their breath froze in the air. This is not just a story about wood and work. It's a story about survival, brotherhood, and the spirit of those who built more than just cabins. They built a nation from the wilderness. So, pull your coat a little tighter, listen to the crackle of the fire, and come with us into the heart of the frozen frontier as we uncover how lumberjacks built bunkhouses to survive the frozen forest camps and more. In the far reaches of North America, where winter wraps the world in ice and silence, men once set out to tame the wilderness. Their story begins with the bite of the axe and the echo of determination in a land untouched by comfort. By the mid to late 19th century, a new kind of frontier had emerged, not one of gold or glory, but of timber. The forests of Maine, Michigan, Wisconsin, and across the Canadian Shield stretched endlessly, a dark and frozen sea of pine and spruce. Here, the lumberjack became both conqueror and captive of nature's extremes. The world beyond those forests was growing hungry. America's cities were rising fast, trailways clawed across the plains, mines sank deep into the earth, and the skeletons of houses and ships demanded wood in staggering amounts. Every nail, every beam, every railroad tie depended on the steady rhythm of men who cut trees in the dead of winter. The work was seasonal by necessity. Only when the rivers froze could logs be hauled from the heart of the forest to the mills waiting downstream. So, as the first snows fell and the lakes turned to glass, thousands of men vanished into the woods, leaving behind towns, families, and civilization itself. The journey north began in the chill of early winter. Long lines of horses pulled sleds laden with saws, axes, cooking pots, and rough tools. Men trudged beside them, wrapped in layers of wool and hope. They called themselves lumberjacks, though many were farmers, immigrants, or wanderers looking for wages to carry them through the year. They came from the coasts of Nova Scotia, from the farms of Wisconsin, from the crowded streets of Quebec and Vermont. Most were young and strong, some were desperate and broken. All were drawn by the promise of pay and the thrill of the unknown. The deeper they moved into the wilderness, the more the world changed. Snow muffled every sound except the crunch of boots and the low murmur of wind through pine needles. Smoke from their breath drifted into the air like ghostly fog. They reached the chosen site by instinct near a frozen river for transport, close to a stand of old-growth pine, sheltered by a ridge or bend in the land. There, amid the stillness, the foreman would shout a few sharp orders, and the work began. Before a single tree was felled, they had to carve out a home from the wilderness itself. The forest was their resource and their enemy. With axes that gleamed in the pale sun, the men chopped down the first logs that would become their shelter. The sound of wood splitting and falling echoed through the valley like gunfire. It was an old rhythm, steady and sure, each swing a small defiance against the cold. They built a crude clearing, pushing aside snow, hacking branches, piling logs. The bunkhouse would rise from this frozen earth, not as a monument to comfort, but as a fortress against the merciless winter. In those first days, survival was a race against time. Snowstorms could roll in without warning, dropping feet of powder overnight. Temperatures plunged far below zero, freezing hands stiff and faces raw. Men wrapped rags around their boots and fingers to keep the blood moving. Their beards froze solid, icicles forming from every breath. Fire became a constant companion. Without it, death could come swiftly. A campfire burned day and night as the structure took shape around it. The men worked with practiced precision. The trees they felled were shaped by axe and adze, their ends notched in dovetail fashion to fit snugly together. Every log was placed by hand, rolled with wooden peavies, lifted by grunts and curses. It was exhausting labor, but it bound the men together. Each swing of the axe meant warmth for the coming nights. Each blow against the trunk was an act of will, a promise that they would endure. The foreman, known as the boss, directed every step. He was a hard man, weathered by seasons in the woods, his authority unquestioned. The cook followed close behind in importance. His tent or cabin would often be the first completed. Without hot food, morale collapsed. In the early camps, meals were simple: salt pork, beans, biscuits, and coffee black enough to melt frostbite. But even a hot meal by the fire could feel like a feast after 12 hours of chopping and hauling. As the walls of the bunkhouse rose, a sense of life began to stir in the camp. Men shouted to one another over the roar of falling timber. Horses snorted in the cold, their breath steaming. The forest floor became a maze of tracks, logs, and sawdust. By nightfall, the camp glowed with the orange flicker of lanterns and the sound of low laughter. For all its hardship, there was something magnetic about this rough world, a kind of freedom that could not be found in the cities below. Each lumberjack carried with him stories, habits, and dreams. Around the evening fire, they swapped tales of ghostly lights in the woods, of bears that stalked the camps, of men who vanished in the snow and were never seen again. Some told of home, of wives and children waiting by the hearth. Others had no home to speak of, only the road ahead. The wilderness was their companion, their proving ground, their cage. When the bunkhouse was finally complete, it stood like a squat fortress of timber in a sea of snow. Inside, the air was heavy with the scent of pine, smoke, and sweat. Rows of bunks lined the walls, stacked 2 or 3 high, each one filled with straw or pine boughs. There were no mattresses, no blankets except those a man brought himself. The central stove glowed constantly, fed with endless cords of wood. Its heat was both a blessing and a curse. Too close, and a man would sweat; too far, and he'd freeze. Boots steamed by the fire, socks hung from rafters, and the sound of snoring filled the air like a distant tide. Outside, the forest loomed silent and immense. Wolves prowled the edges of the camp, their howls echoing through the night. The stars burned hard and bright, the moon casting silver across the frozen landscape. Inside, the men lay shoulder to shoulder, drifting to sleep beneath layers of wool, listening to the wind scrape against the logs. They were safe for now. Tomorrow, the real work would begin. The first days in camp were a balance between exhaustion and preparation. They cleared paths through the forest, marked the largest pines, and sharpened their saws. Everything depended on precision. A careless felling could splinter a valuable tree or crush a man. The boss paired the men into teams, one handling the axe, the other the saw. Communication was minimal. They learned each other's rhythm by instinct. The forest soon came alive with sound, the steady hum of saws, the crack of branches, the thunderous crash of falling giants. Each tree that fell was stripped, measured, and hauled onto sleds drawn by horses with bells tied to their harnesses to keep the rhythm. The bells rang softly through the snow, a strange music in the wilderness. As the weeks passed, the bunkhouse became a world of its own. The men joked, quarreled, and sang. Some carved their initials into the wood, marking their brief claim on the place. Others sat quietly, writing letters by lantern light that might never be sent. Snow built up against the outer walls until only the chimney and roof were visible from a distance. The camp seemed swallowed by winter, a flicker of human warmth in a land made of cold. Despite the hardship, the life held a fierce pride. These were men who could endure what few others dared. They learned to read the forest's moods, to tell by the sound of creaking branches when a storm was coming, to measure distance by the time it took for an echo to return. They knew how to move silently across snow, how to start a fire with frozen hands, how to mend a sled or fashion a handle from a fallen limb. Every skill was survival. Every mistake was a lesson carved in frost. When the rare thaw came, the forest revealed its secret beauty. Ice crystals clung to branches like diamonds, sunlight filtering through in pale gold. Smoke curled lazily from the bunkhouse chimney, the only sign of life for miles. Inside, men stirred, stretched, and prepared for another day's work. The cook rang his triangle, and laughter erupted as they crowded around tin plates piled high with food. There was camaraderie here that the outside world could not match. In this frozen isolation, class, nationality, and language meant little. What mattered was strength, endurance, and the will to see another sunrise. As winter deepened, so did the bond between men and land. The forest became both adversary and teacher. Each swing of the axe, each cut of the saw, was a conversation between human will and nature's patience. In the rhythm of labor, the men found meaning, a harsh, elemental purpose that few would ever understand. They worked not for glory, but for survival, for a few dollars a week, for the satisfaction of knowing they could stand where few dared to tread. By the end of the season, when the rivers began to thaw and the logs were ready for their long journey downstream, the bunkhouse stood weathered and scarred. Its timbers bore the marks of 100 nights of laughter, sweat, and endurance. Around it lay the remnants of a hard winter, discarded boots, rusted nails, a broken sled, and countless stumps marking where giants had once stood. The men would soon leave, their tracks fading into melting snow, but the story of their survival would linger like smoke in the cold air. For a few brief months each year, these frozen camps became small kingdoms of human willpower, carved out against impossible odds. The lumberjacks who built them asked for little: warmth, food, and the strength to last the season. They gave in return the bones of the modern world: railways, ships, cities, and homes, all born from the trees they cut in silence. In the endless forests of the north, beneath skies of iron and snow, they proved that even in the harshest wilderness, mankind could build, endure, and call the wild their home. The forest was the first enemy and the first provider. When the men arrived at their chosen camp, the wilderness stretched out in every direction, an endless maze of snow-laden trees, frozen streams, and silence so deep that even the wind seemed cautious to disturb it. Yet this was where they would live for months on end, cut off from civilization, bound by the cold and by each other. Before the first pine fell for profit, another kind of construction had to begin, the making of shelter, a refuge carved from the very elements that sought to destroy them. The bunkhouse was the heart of every lumber camp, but in the beginning it was nothing more than a dream against the cold. There were no plans drawn, no blueprints. Experience was their architect and necessity their builder. The men who had spent years in the woods knew exactly what was needed: warmth, strength, and speed. A bunkhouse had to rise quickly before frostbite and exhaustion took their toll. They began by clearing a flat patch of land near a river or creek, close enough for water and hauling, but high enough to avoid spring floods. The snow was shoveled aside, revealing the hard, frozen ground beneath. The first logs came from the trees nearest the site, felled and trimmed with a precision that came only from years of repetition. The crack of an axe against bark echoed like a heartbeat through the trees. The rhythm of men working in unison filled the cold air. Swing, breathe, crack, thud. Each sound was a promise that warmth was coming. Once a dozen good logs were cut, The shaping began. The ends were notched in a dovetail pattern, each one carved by hand with a broad axe. These notches would lock the corners together, giving the structure its strength. The first layer of logs, called the sill, was laid carefully on stones or blocks of frozen earth to keep it off the damp ground. Then, slowly, the walls began to rise. Each new log was rolled into place with wooden peavies and lifted by sheer muscle and teamwork. The men worked in silence for long stretches, communicating with gestures or short commands. The cold was too bitter for idle talk. Breath steamed from their mouths as they strained under the weight of each timber. Their gloves were stiff with frost. Their faces burned red from the cold. Yet the work continued, hour after hour, until the low winter sun faded and lanterns were lit. The flicker of firelight danced across the unfinished walls, giving shape to what would soon become their home. By the end of the first day, the rough skeleton of the bunkhouse was visible. The men gathered around the fire, their muscles trembling from fatigue. They huddled close, boots steaming, hands stretched toward the flames. Someone pulled a harmonica from a pocket and played a slow, mournful tune. It carried softly through the pines, a fragile sound in the frozen dark. Tomorrow, they knew, the work would begin again. Over the next days, the structure took on form. The gaps between logs, called chinks, were stuffed with moss, clay, mud, and sometimes even scraps of cloth. This chinking was vital. Without it, the icy wind would slip through every crack and turn the cabin into a freezer. The roof was made from overlapping logs or rough, hewn planks, then covered with bark or thatch. Later camps used tar paper or shingles, but in these early days, they used whatever the forest provided. Snow piled thickly on top, adding both insulation and weight to keep the roof steady in the storms. Inside, the men transformed the bare walls into a livable space. They laid a floor of rough boards when time allowed, though in many camps the floor was simply packed dirt or frozen ground. Against one wall, they built a massive stove or fireplace from stones gathered along the river. The stove was the lifeline of the bunkhouse. It burned constantly, day and night. Without it, the camp would not last a week. Around the stove was where life happened. Boots and socks dried by the fire, wet clothes hissed and smoked as they hung from poles overhead. Men crowded close, soaking in the warmth, their cheeks glowing red. The first to rise in the morning had the duty of feeding the stove, and he was treated like a hero for doing so. In the dead of night, when the fire began to fade, someone would always stir and toss another log on. The fire could never be allowed to die. The sleeping arrangements were simple and brutal. Along the walls, bunks were built in 2 or 3 tiers, wooden frames filled with hay, straw, or pine boughs. The scent of pine needles filled the room, mingling with the heavy aroma of sweat, smoke, and wet wool. The upper bunks were the warmest, where heat from the stove rose and lingered. The lower ones were colder, often damp with melted snow tracked in from outside. A man's bunk was his only private space in the world. He kept his few belongings there, an extra shirt, a knife, maybe a letter from home folded between layers of cloth. The bunkhouse could hold 20, 30, sometimes 40 men. When full, it was a riot of sounds, snoring, coughing, laughter, and the constant crackle of the fire. The air grew thick and smoky, but no one complained. The alternative was worse, the empty, endless cold beyond those walls. In the first weeks of camp, sickness was rare. The cold killed most germs, and the men's bodies burned hot with work. But as the season dragged on, fatigue set in. Colds, frostbite, and infections became common. A simple cut could turn deadly if left untreated. Still, the men endured, using whiskey, hot water, and crude remedies to patch themselves up. There was no doctor, no medicine, only the will to keep working. The cook's shack stood nearby, and from it drifted the constant scent of coffee, beans, and frying pork. The cook was the soul of the camp. He rose before dawn and worked long after the others had slept. His job was as vital as the foreman's, for good food meant strength and morale. The men would gather in the mess hall, often just an open lean-to or a smaller cabin, and eat from tin plates seated on benches made of logs. They ate fast in near silence before trudging back into the woods for another day. By night, the bunkhouse became a different world. The men returned from the forest with snow in their beards and exhaustion in their bones. They shed their heavy coats and boots by the fire, stamping their feet and laughing through chattering teeth. Someone would tell a story, a tall tale about a bear or a lost prospector or a tree so large it took 3 days to cut down. Another would hum an old tune, and soon others joined in. For a moment, the harshness of their lives melted away. The bunkhouse was never quiet for long. Even in the small hours of the night, there were the sounds of shifting bodies, the creak of bunks, the hiss of the stove. Lice were an inevitable plague, known as graybacks. The men joked about them but scratched constantly. They claimed the heat made the lice sleepy, but no one believed it. There were no baths, no change of clothes for weeks. Yet compared to the blizzards outside, even a lice-ridden bunkhouse was heaven. Sometimes, after a storm, the men would wake to find the entire building half buried in snow. The door had to be dug open with shovels before anyone could step outside. The walls creaked under the weight, but rarely did one collapse. These cabins were built to last, not for beauty, but for endurance. They were ugly, smoky, and cramped, but they were strong. The men took pride in that. Their work in the woods was brutal, but their home was proof that even in the wildest cold, they could build something that endured. Occasionally, a new man would arrive from town. Soft hands, clean clothes, eyes wide with the shock of the cold. He would look around the bunkhouse with disbelief. The veterans watched him quietly, waiting. After a few days of sweat and frost, he would look just like the rest of them, hardened, rough, and proud. The bunkhouse had a way of stripping away pretense. Inside those walls, everyone was equal before the cold. Outside, the snow fell in endless silence. Smoke from the chimney rose into the gray sky, twisting upward before vanishing into the wind. From a distance, the camp looked small, almost insignificant against the vastness of the forest. But inside, it pulsed with life, fire, laughter, and the raw persistence of men who refused to yield. By midwinter, the bunkhouse had become more than a shelter. It was the center of a small, self-contained world. The men called it the home, or simply the shack, and they spoke of it with an odd affection. It was where they thawed their hands, where they told stories, where they endured and survived. The logs that formed its walls had once stood tall and silent in the woods, but now they sheltered the men who had cut them down. There was a strange poetry in that, though few had time to notice. For all its crudity, there was a rhythm to life in the bunkhouse, a daily cycle of labor, warmth, and rest. It began before dawn, when the cook's bell or the sound of boots thumping on the floor roused everyone. The men groaned, stretched, and reached for frozen socks that had stiffened overnight. Outside, the world was still dark, the stars pale against a sky of deep blue. Inside, the fire flared, casting gold across their faces. They dressed in silence, moving like machines wounded by routine. Then came breakfast, hot, heavy, and eaten fast. Within an hour, the bunkhouse was empty, left to the crackling stove and the smell of smoke. The silence that followed was profound. Only the occasional pop of wood reminded the walls that men had been there. And as the day went on, the forest outside rang with the sound of their labor once again. When they returned at dusk, the transformation was instant. The bunkhouse filled with voices, laughter, the clatter of tin plates and boots. The fire roared high, chasing away the shadows. The men joked about the day's work, argued over whose tree was largest, or shared tobacco and stories in easy camaraderie. The camp was alive again, the cold forgotten, at least for a few hours. There was no decoration, no comfort, but there was a strange beauty in the simplicity. The bunkhouse represented everything about the lumberjack's life: harsh, unyielding, yet fiercely alive. It was born of necessity, built with strength, and maintained by will. In a land where even breath could freeze in the air, the bunkhouse was proof that humanity could carve a beating heart in the center of an unforgiving world. The forest was no place for the faint of heart, and the lumber camps that dotted the northern wilderness of America and Canada in the 19th century were proof of that. Each winter, men left behind the relative comfort of towns and villages to vanish into the deep woods, following the call of the logging companies that needed timber to feed a rapidly industrializing nation. But before the first tree could fall, before the rhythmic thud of axes echoed through the frozen air, there was one task that decided whether the season would be bearable or brutal: building the bunkhouse. It began in late autumn, when the first flurries of snow drifted through the endless forest. The men arrived with their teams of oxen, sleighs piled high with saws, axes, and supplies. The foreman would pick a spot near a river or frozen stream, a lifeline for water, transport, and the spring log drive that would come months later. The clearing was hacked out of the wilderness, trees felled not for profit, but for survival. The bunkhouse would rise from the very woods that surrounded it, each log cut, peeled, and notched by the same hands that would later swing the axes at dawn. In the biting cold, there was no time for hesitation. Every man had a role, some cutting logs, others dragging them across the snow to the building site. The sound of iron striking wood echoed endlessly, a steady, primitive rhythm that seemed to defy the silence of the forest. The men's breath hung in clouds around them, their beards stiff with frost, their gloves stiff from dampness and cold. They worked from first light to darkness, the only warmth coming from their exertion and the fires that smoldered nearby. The structure itself was simple, yet ingenious: a rectangular shell of hand-hewn logs, stacked and locked together at the corners with saddle notches. Gaps between the logs were packed with moss, clay, or whatever material could keep out the wind. The roof, steeply pitched to shed snow, was covered with bark or cedar shingles, held down by poles. A single door marked the entrance, sometimes no more than a rough plank on hinges fashioned from rawhide or iron scraps. Inside, the space was crude but functional. The floor, when there was one, was made of split logs laid flat. Most camps couldn't afford such luxury, and the men slept directly on beds of evergreen boughs spread across raised wooden platforms. Dozens of men would share the same room, one long, narrow chamber filled with the smells of pine, sweat, and smoke. At one end stood the great iron stove, its belly glowing red through the night, fed constantly with slabs of green wood. Around it, the lumberjacks thawed their socks, cooked their tea, and told stories that blurred the line between truth and legend. The bunkhouse was not merely a shelter, it was civilization in the wilderness. Within its walls, men forged a rough kind of brotherhood, born not from sentiment but from necessity. Outside, temperatures plunged to 40 below, winds howled through the pines, and wolves roamed the edges of camp. But inside, there was the smell of tobacco, the hiss of boiling water, and the low murmur of conversation that could lull a weary man to sleep even as the logs cracked and popped in the stove. Building such a place required experience and instinct. The foreman, often an old logger who had seen dozens of winters, knew exactly how to position the bunkhouse not too close to the river, where spring floods could sweep it away, and not too far, where hauling water would become an endless chore. He knew to face the door away from prevailing winds and to build the roof with a vent hole near the ridge to let the smoke escape without letting in too much snow. Every choice was born of trial and error, each camp learning from the mistakes of the last. In those early days, before the logging industry adopted railroads and portable mills, camps were almost entirely self-sufficient. The men built everything themselves: bunkhouse, cookhouse, blacksmith shed, and sometimes even a tiny storehouse for flour and salted pork. Nothing was wasted. Bark became roofing. Stumps were used for chopping blocks. If a man had a scrap of canvas or old sacking, it became insulation for his sleeping bunk. Even the sawdust that piled up from cutting logs was swept into the cracks in the floor to keep out drafts. When the first snowstorm swept across the camp, the bunkhouse would be barely finished, a rough skeleton of logs that somehow managed to stand against the gale. Snow piled high against the walls, the wind whistled through every gap, and yet inside, the men gathered around the stove, boots steaming, hands trembling as they held tin cups of boiling tea. In that moment, the bunkhouse became a fortress against the elements, not a comfortable one, but enough to keep the biting edge of death at bay. There were stories told in those first nights that became part of lumberjack lore. Tales of camps where the roof collapsed under snow, or where the stove smoke filled the bunkhouse because someone forgot to cut a vent. But there were also stories of triumph of men who built a livable shelter in less than a week, who managed to dry their clothes, eat hot stew, and sleep soundly while the blizzard raged outside. The measure of a good camp wasn't luxury, it was endurance. Could the bunkhouse keep its men alive until spring? That was all that mattered. As the season wore on, the bunkhouse evolved. Early camps were crude, dark, and overcrowded. But as the industry grew wealthier, and logging companies learned the value of keeping men alive and working, the designs improved. Some bunkhouses were fitted with plank floors, others with small windows covered in oiled paper to let in a faint, yellow light. The best camps even had bunks stacked in tiers, giving each man a personal space, however small. Yet even in the most modern camps, the atmosphere remained primitive. The air was thick with wood smoke. The stove burned too hot near its center and too cold at the edges, and the men snored in chorus, an orchestra of exhaustion. Every nail, every log in that building told a story. Many of the men who built them had been farmers, trappers, or immigrants from Scandinavia, Ireland, and Eastern Europe. They brought with them old traditions of timberwork, ways of notching logs, layering roofs, and crafting doors from raw planks that had been used for generations in their homelands. The bunkhouse, in a sense, was a cultural mosaic, built from pieces of many worlds and bound together by the sheer will to survive in the cold heart of the North. The day's work would end long after sunset. When the final log was placed and the stove began to glow, a silence would fall over the camp that was unlike any other. Outside, the stars burned fiercely in the black sky, their light reflecting off the snow in cold brilliance. Inside, men spoke in low tones, their voices heavy with fatigue. The sound of a saw being sharpened might cut through the quiet, or the creak of a bunk as someone turned in his sleep. In those moments, surrounded by wood and flame, every man knew the same truth, that the bunkhouse was not just a shelter. It was life itself, fragile, imperfect, and utterly essential, and yet it was also temporary. When spring came and the ice broke on the river, the men would load their logs onto the current and move on. The camp would be abandoned, the bunkhouse left to rot where it stood, moss creeping over the logs, the roof sagging under the weight of another year's snow. Nature always reclaimed what was hers. By the next winter, a new camp would rise in another clearing, built from the same trees by the same kind of men, for the same unyielding purpose. The process repeated year after year, creating a silent lineage of bunkhouses scattered across the northern forests, ghosts of an industry that reshaped the continent. Today, few of those structures remain. Most have collapsed, their timbers lost to time and decay, but if you wander deep enough into the woods, you might still find the outline of one, a sunken foundation, a few blackened nails, the ghostly impression of human hands that once built a home against impossible odds. The lumberjacks didn't see themselves as heroes. They were workers, bound by necessity, earning their pay in sweat and frostbite. But the bunkhouses they built stand as monuments to a kind of resilience rarely seen today, a reminder that civilization, in its rawest form, begins not with comfort, but with survival. It begins with the first log laid in the snow, the first spark in the stove, the first night a man sleeps in warmth instead of cold. That is where the story of the lumberjack truly begins. When the bunkhouse was built and the stove burned steadily through the frozen nights, life in the logging camp began in earnest. The wilderness, once silent and untouched, now echoed with the constant rhythm of human labor, the thud of axes, the rasp of crosscut saws, and the shouts of men calling to one another through the trees. It was a world within a world, isolated and self-contained, where every man knew his role, every task had its time, and every dawn brought the same unrelenting challenge: survive, work, endure. Morning came long before sunrise. The forest was still black and heavy with frost when the cook's bell rang through the camp, a harsh, metallic sound that sliced through the silence like a saw through timber. Inside the bunkhouse, men stirred from their bunks, groaning and swearing, reluctant to leave what little warmth they had found. The air was thick with smoke and the sour scent of unwashed bodies. Frost formed on the inside walls, glittering in the dim light of the stove. Boots left too close to the fire were stiff and steaming. Others, left too far, were frozen solid. The cookhouse was the heart of the camp at dawn. There, in a low, smoky building beside the bunkhouse, the cook and his helper, known as the cookie, had been awake for hours, stoking fires and preparing the enormous meal that fueled the day. Pancakes, beans, salted pork, and thick black coffee, not refined fare, but heavy, filling, and hot. The men crowded in, eating fast, their conversation little more than grunts and mutters. They shoveled down food as if it were fuel, because in truth it was. The work ahead would demand every ounce of energy their bodies could muster. After breakfast, the foreman barked orders, his voice cutting through the cold. Teams were assigned their sections of forest, the limits, as they were called. Each crew consisted of a few sawyers, a teamster with oxen or horses, and a swampman who cleared brush and trimmed branches. The men wrapped scarves around their faces, pulled on their mitts, and stepped out into the pale, frozen light. By the time the sun crept over the horizon, the forest was alive with motion. The work of felling trees was brutal, repetitive, and dangerously beautiful. Two men stood on opposite sides of a great pine, gripping a crosscut saw as long as a man's height. The saw's teeth bit rhythmically into the wood, sending showers of frost and sap into the air. The tree groaned, leaned, and after minutes of relentless cutting, gave way with a thunderous crash that echoed for miles. The ground shuddered beneath the men's boots. For a brief moment, the forest was silent again, then the sawyers moved on to the next tree, and the cycle repeated. In the logging camp, everything revolved around efficiency and endurance. The men were paid by the season, not the day, and every hour lost to weather or fatigue meant less timber hauled to the river come spring. There were no machines, no shortcuts, only human muscle and animal strength. The sawyers felled the trees, the swampers trimmed the limbs, and the teamsters dragged the logs along ice-covered skid roads to the landing. There, the logs were piled in massive heaps, ready to be sent down river when the thaw came. Every movement was timed, every job depended on another, and the rhythm of labor was as steady as a heartbeat. The dangers were constant. A falling tree could twist unexpectedly and crush a man before he had time to shout. Axes glanced off frozen wood and split flesh instead. Teamsters risked being crushed between sleds and logs or thrown beneath the hooves of their own horses. The cold itself was an enemy, merciless and unrelenting. Frostbite claimed fingers and ears. The chill seeped through wool and leather until even the strongest men shook uncontrollably. Yet, despite the danger, there was a fierce pride among the loggers. To survive a winter in the woods was a mark of toughness few could claim. When noon came, there was no rest. The men gathered in small groups at the edge of their limits, eating their packed lunches, bread, beans, and salt pork, all washed down with tea carried in tin cans. They ate standing up, leaning on their axes, eyes fixed on the next tree. Conversation was sparse, the silence broken only by the groaning of ice in the distance or the sudden caw of a raven overhead. In the wilderness, time felt endless, but every man knew that daylight was precious. When darkness fell, the cold deepened, and the forest became a place of shadows and peril. By late afternoon, the men began their long trudge back to camp. Their clothes were stiff with ice, their faces raw and wind-burned. The sound of sleigh bells marked the return of the teamsters, their oxen plodding slowly through the snow, breath steaming in the fading light. As they reached the camp, smoke rose from the cookhouse chimney, carrying with it the promise of warmth, food, and rest, the simple comforts that kept them human. Supper was the only time of day when the camp truly came alive. The men crowded around the long tables, their laughter loud and coarse, their appetites insatiable. The cook's stew pots were scraped clean, and the coffee poured endlessly until the last man was full. Tobacco smoke filled the room. The air grew thick with stories and rough humor. There were songs, old folk tunes from Ireland, sea shanties from the Maritimes, ballads of love and home that no man would admit to singing in daylight. For a brief hour, the harshness of their lives faded, replaced by camaraderie and the warmth of shared exhaustion. After supper, some men repaired tools, sharpening axes, mending harnesses, or oiling saws. Others wrote letters home, their handwriting clumsy and slow after a day of gripping steel. Many simply collapsed on their bunks, boots still on, drifting into a dreamless sleep as the stove crackled nearby. The foreman would make one last round, checking that the fires were banked and the lanterns extinguished. Outside, the wind howled through the trees, rattling the bunkhouse walls, but inside, there was only the steady rhythm of breathing, a chorus of fatigue that lasted until the next dawn. Life in the camp was ruled by routine, yet within that routine existed a strange sense of freedom. Away from cities and farms, the men lived by their own code. There were no uniforms, no sermons, no police. Discipline came from respect, and the foreman's authority rested on strength and fairness, not rank. A man who shirked work or stole from another was dealt with swiftly, sometimes with fists, sometimes with exile. But most quarrels were short-lived. In the wilderness, grudges were a luxury no one could afford. There were, of course, moments of joy amid the hardship. On Sundays, when the weather allowed, the men rested. Some washed their clothes in icy streams. Others mended their gear or trimmed their beards. A few simply wandered into the forest, seeking solitude among the snow-laden trees. Occasionally, a traveling preacher or peddler would reach the camp, bringing news from the outside world, tales of wars, elections, or prices in distant towns. For an hour or two, the camp would buzz with curiosity, the men hungry for any fragment of civilization that broke the monotony of their isolation. But isolation also bred a kind of introspection. Many of the men were wanderers, farmhands, sailors, immigrants who had come seeking work and found only endless forest. They spoke little of their pasts. The bunkhouse at night was full of unspoken stories of families left behind, debts unpaid, or dreams deferred. Yet in that shared silence there was also kinship. The forest stripped every man down to the same essentials: strength, endurance, and will. In the logging camp, it didn't matter where you came from, only that you could swing an axe and face the cold without complaint. The camp itself was a marvel of human adaptation. Crude though it was, it functioned like a living organism, every part dependent on the others. The cook fed the men, the blacksmith repaired their tools, the teamsters kept the logs moving, and the foreman kept the entire machine from breaking down. There was no wasted motion, no idle luxury. Even leisure had its purpose, to keep the men sane through months of darkness and repetition. In its own way, the logging camp was a microcosm of survival, a fragile balance between man, nature, and the relentless need to endure. By midwinter, when the snow lay deep and the nights stretched endlessly, the camp reached its full rhythm. The men no longer spoke of towns or homes. Their world had shrunk to the boundaries of the forest and the glow of the bunkhouse stove. They measured time not by dates, but by the number of sled loads hauled, the piles of logs at the landing, the diminishing stack of flour in the cookhouse. Beyond the camp, the wilderness seemed infinite, an ocean of white silence broken only by the occasional howl of a wolf or the distant crack of a falling tree. Inside that frozen isolation, the men became both prisoners and kings. They lived hard, worked harder, and carved their existence out of the heart of the wilderness. The bunkhouse walls held their laughter, their arguments, and their silence. The forest, indifferent and vast, surrounded them on all sides, a constant reminder that no matter how sturdy their shelter, they were still guests in a land that belonged to the snow and the pines. As the winter deepened, the camp became its own universe, isolated, rhythmic, and bound by unwritten laws. The forest outside was buried beneath feet of snow, every tree heavy with ice, every sound muted by the frozen air. Inside the circle of bunkhouses and sheds, life went on like clockwork. Each man moved through his days with the same deliberate repetition: eat, work, sleep, and repeat. Yet beneath that monotony, the camp pulsed with life, the raw, unfiltered humanity of men forced to share close quarters under the harshest conditions imaginable. Evening in the bunkhouse was a world of its own. After supper, when the last of the daylight had vanished and the fire in the stove glowed like a small sun, the men gathered around it in loose circles. Some sat sharpening their axes with whetstones, the slow scrape echoing through the smoky room. Others played cards on overturned crates, coins clinking softly as wagers were made. Tobacco smoke hung thick in the air, curling toward the ceiling where frost gathered in ghostly patterns. The light flickered across weary faces, faces etched with exhaustion, laughter, and the kind of quiet determination that comes from knowing tomorrow would be exactly the same as today. Conversations ranged from crude jokes to deep reflections, depending on the mood of the night. Some men told tall tales of adventure hunting, bears in the north, outsmarting bosses, or surviving accidents that should have killed them. Others spoke of home in hushed tones, wives, children, farms left behind. For many, the bunkhouse was the only place where they could let down the hard mask of the workday. Here, among equals, vulnerability wasn't weakness, it was simply part of being human in an inhuman world. There were rivalries, of course. Hard men living shoulder to shoulder for months inevitably clashed. A careless word, a cheating hand in a card game, or even a stolen pair of socks could spark a fight. The foreman rarely interfered unless blood was drawn. Fights were usually short, fierce, and quickly forgotten. The next morning, both men would be back in the woods, cutting side by side, their anger frozen and buried beneath the snow. In the camp, grudges had no space to live. The work demanded unity, and the forest punished division. Despite their roughness, The lumberjacks lived by a code, a rugged, unspoken sense of honor. Stealing from another man was unthinkable. Laziness was despised. Courage and endurance earned respect faster than words ever could. A man's reputation was forged not in talk, but in toil. The strongest, hardest working loggers were looked up to not as leaders appointed by any company, but as living symbols of what survival demanded. There was no hierarchy beyond skill and grit. Occasionally, the monotony of camp life was broken by something unexpected. A supply sleigh might arrive from the nearest settlement, bringing letters, fresh tobacco, or new tools. The arrival of mail was an event, a moment of connection with the world beyond the forest. Men who rarely spoke would handle their letters with reverence, reading by lantern light, eyes tracing the familiar handwriting of someone far away. Others, who received nothing, would hide their disappointment behind jokes or silence. The wilderness could make a man strong, but it could also make him lonely in ways he never spoke of aloud. Winter nights were long, and when the storm winds howled through the trees, the bunkhouse shook as if alive. Snow drifted against the door until it was impossible to open without digging. The stove was kept roaring through such nights, fed constantly with wood, its iron sides glowing cherry red. The men would gather closer, trading stories to drown the sound of the gale outside. Some spoke of ghost tales, spirits of loggers lost in snowstorms, or phantom oxen teams seen hauling invisible loads down frozen trails. The line between myth and memory blurred easily in the dark, and even the toughest men felt a shiver that had nothing to do with the cold. Illness was one of the few things the bunkhouse could not keep out. A bad cold, a fever, or an infected wound could spread quickly through the close quarters. There were no doctors, no medicine beyond what the camp cook might offer, a mixture of herbs, whiskey, and hope. If a man became too sick to work, he was often left to rest in the bunkhouse while others took his load. Sometimes he recovered, sometimes he didn't. Death, when it came, was met with stoic silence. The men would stop work long enough to bury their comrade under the pines, marking the grave with a rough wooden cross. Then they would return to their saws. It was not callousness, it was survival. The forest allowed no sentimentality. The cook, often overlooked by outsiders, was in many ways the soul of the camp. His temper could make or break the men's morale. A good cook could lift spirits with hearty meals and rough humor. A bad one could sour an entire winter. Food meant strength, and strength meant survival. Stories circulated of legendary cooks who could make beans taste like feasts and flapjacks that kept men warm for hours. In truth, most meals were plain and repetitive, but they were hot and plentiful, and in a world of endless cold, that was enough. Sundays, when they came, were strange islands of stillness. The saws fell silent, the oxen rested, and the men lingered in their bunks longer than usual. Some washed, shaved, or repaired torn clothing. Others sat quietly, staring into the fire, their thoughts far away. A few men read from pocket Bibles, their voices low and steady. Religion in the camps was not formal. There were no chapels or sermons, but faith lingered in small gestures. A cross hung over a bunk, a whispered prayer before sleep, a hymn sung softly in the dark. In the wilderness, belief became simple, not a doctrine, but a hope that something greater watched over them. For entertainment, the men created their own. Storytelling was an art, honed over countless nights. The best storytellers were treated like celebrities, their tales of adventure, comedy, or horror eagerly awaited. Sometimes they sang deep, rough voices rising in harmony, echoing through the bunkhouse like the call of the forest itself. Other nights, they carved small figures from wood, whittling by lamplight to pass the hours. These small acts of creativity were sparks of civilization in an otherwise primitive existence, proof that even in the harshest conditions, The human spirit sought beauty. As winter edged toward spring, the atmosphere in camp changed subtly. The men grew restless, the days lengthened, the snow softened, and the rivers began to stir beneath their icy shells. Soon, the logging would give way to the most dangerous part of all the river drive. The logs that had been hauled and stacked for months would be sent downstream to the mills, guided by men who would dance on spinning timber and risk their lives in freezing water. The bunkhouse would empty, its beds left cold, its fire left to die. But for now, the men worked harder than ever, determined to finish their quotas before the thaw. In those final weeks, camaraderie burned brightest. The men laughed louder, worked faster, and shared more freely. They had survived another winter together, something few could boast. Friendships forged in that environment were unlike any other. When the season ended and the men drifted back to towns and farms, many would part ways forever, but they carried with them a bond no outsider could understand. They had faced the forest and won, at least for a time. For all its hardship, life in the logging camp had a strange allure. Many who swore they'd never return found themselves back the next winter, drawn by something they couldn't name. Perhaps it was the simplicity, the clarity of a life stripped to its essentials. Perhaps it was the pride of mastering the wilderness, of proving one's worth through labor and endurance. Or perhaps it was the camaraderie, the sense of belonging that could only be found in shared struggle. Whatever the reason, the camps never lacked for men willing to trade comfort for the raw, honest life of the woods. When we look back now, it's easy to romanticize the lumberjack, to imagine him as a larger-than-life figure, a folk hero clad in flannel and steel. But the truth was harsher and more human. These men were laborers, exiles, and dreamers, driven by need as much as courage. They lived in conditions most of us can scarcely imagine, yet they built an industry that fueled nations, cleared the way for towns, and laid the foundations of modern North America. Their stories, preserved in fragments and folklore, speak not only of hardship, but of endurance, community, and the stubborn will to survive. As the last winter night closed around the camp, the firelight flickered over weary faces, casting long shadows on the log walls. Outside, the forest slept beneath a mantle of snow, silent and eternal. Inside, a dozen men breathed in unison, the air thick with smoke and dreams. Tomorrow, the saws would sing again, and another tree would fall. The cycle would continue, as it always had: men and timber, frost and fire, work and rest, life and death, all bound together in the endless rhythm of the logging camp. They called it roughing it, but that phrase was far too gentle for what the men of the bunkhouse endured. Life in the lumber camps was a trial of strength, patience, and wit, a constant tug between misery and laughter, frost and firelight. By the middle of winter, when the snow lay so deep it swallowed entire stumps and the rivers were buried under glassy ice, the men who remained in the camps had already proven something to themselves. The faint-hearted had gone home before Christmas, their spirits broken by the unending cold. Those who stayed became part of a breed apart, lumberjacks whose calloused hands, wind-burnt faces, and raw humor built the quiet fraternity of the woods. Inside the bunkhouse, the air was thick with the scent of wet wool, pipe smoke, and sweat. The stove glowed red at the center, like the heart of some enormous beast, keeping everyone alive through sheer heat. Around it, the men gathered in loose circles at the end of each back. Breaking day, boots steamed by the fire, socks hung in uneven rows on a line stretched across the rafters. Someone sharpened an axe by lantern light. Someone else mended a torn mitten or carved his initials into the wall, and always, above the crackle of wood and the hum of the wind outside, there was laughter. The jokes were crude, the stories taller than the pines outside. The men exaggerated every adventure, every scrape with danger. One logger would claim he'd seen a moose big enough to block the sun. Another swore he'd once felled 50 trees in a single day. The others would groan, then laugh until tears froze on their lashes. These tall tales were their shield against despair. When you worked from dawn to dusk in temperatures that could kill, humor became a survival tool. It wasn't about the truth. It was about endurance. Each man in the camp had a story of hardship that had driven him there. Some were farmers who'd lost their land to debt. Others were immigrants from Scandinavia or the British Isles, drawn by the promise of steady pay and cheap board. Many were wanderers with nowhere else to go, men escaping the failures of the world beyond the tree line. Yet here in this frozen exile they found something like belonging. The work stripped away pretense. No one cared where you came from, only that you could swing an axe, haul a sled, and share your last bit of tobacco when someone ran dry. The days began before dawn, with a cook's whistle echoing through the timber like a battle call. Breakfast was loud and hurried. Tin plates clattered, coffee hissed in battered pots, and men wolfed down flapjacks, salt pork, and beans by lantern light. They knew what awaited them outside: miles of snow, endless trees, and the unrelenting rhythm of axes and saws. The bunkhouse emptied in minutes, leaving behind the fading smell of coffee and the sound of the stove settling in its own heat. By midday, frost had caked their beards, and the forest rang with the echo of falling timber. The men worked in pairs, sawyers and swampers, teamsters and loaders, each depending on the other to stay alive. Misjudge a fall and a tree could crush you in an instant. Step wrong on the ice and you might vanish beneath a frozen river. There were no doctors out here, no time for weakness. Injuries were treated with crude remedies and stubborn grit. A broken bone might mean the end of a season's wages, or worse, the end of a man's use to the company. When they returned at dusk, stumbling through drifts and dragging their gear, the bunkhouse glowed like a beacon. That warmth, that rough fellowship waiting inside, was the reward for the day's labor. It wasn't comfort as most people would know it. There were no soft beds, no privacy, no quiet, but it was theirs. They'd built it with their own hands, every log fitted tight, every draft patched with moss. The bunkhouse was more than shelter. It was proof of survival. Once supper was served, the mood began to lift. The cook, often a gruff but beloved tyrant, ruled the dining shack with an iron ladle. His food might have been greasy, but it filled bellies and lifted spirits. Some nights he'd sneak in a treat: molasses cookies, a slab of pie, or even dried fruit if supplies had come through. The men cheered as though he'd handed them gold. Then came the real heart of the evening, the storytelling. They called it yarning. After dinner, as the wind howled outside and the stove roared within, the bunkhouse turned into a theater of voices. Every man took his turn spinning a tale. There were ghost stories from the deep woods, legends of giant lumberjacks, and tales of trickery played on rival camps. One might tell of a bear that had learned to steal lunches from the sleds. Another would recount how a greenhorn had accidentally cut down the foreman's outhouse. Laughter rolled through the bunks until the roof itself seemed to shake. This humor, rough, reckless, and defiant, wasn't just entertainment. It was medicine for the soul. The men knew that laughter could drive back the loneliness that haunted them. Winter was long, and homesickness came in waves. Some had wives and children hundreds of miles away. Others had no one waiting for them at all, but when the jokes flew and the stories grew wild, the ache of distance softened. The bunkhouse became, for a few hours each night, a kind of sanctuary. Sometimes music filled the space. A man might pull a mouth organ from his coat or strum a battered fiddle. The tunes were simple: folk songs from Ireland, ballads from Nova Scotia, shanties from the Great Lakes. The melodies floated above the crackling fire and mingled with the moan of the wind. Some men sang softly, others clapped along, their boots thudding the rhythm. The sound bound them together in a way words never could. In those moments, the bunkhouse wasn't just a place to sleep. It was a living memory of all the voices that had passed through it. But not every night was laughter and song. Some evenings the mood was heavy. When injuries or accidents took a man, the silence in the bunkhouse was deep enough to feel. The empty bunk was a grim reminder of the dangers they all faced. Yet even then, there was a kind of brotherhood in grief. The men pooled their pay to send a letter home or to bury their comrade near the camp. Death was not uncommon, but it was never ignored. Out here, remembrance was the only form of justice. And so hardship and humor lived side by side. The harder the work, the louder the laughter, the colder the nights, the stronger the stories. Each man carried his share of misery, but they learned to share it through jokes, teasing, and companionship. It wasn't that they were immune to pain, it was that they refused to let it break them. The bunkhouse was their shield against the wilderness, and each other's company was the warmth that kept them human. Sometimes fights broke out. A careless insult, a spilled cup of coffee, or a stolen blank, it could spark a brawl. But even the fights had their own strange rhythm. They were explosions of energy, over almost as soon as they began. By morning, grudges had melted like frost. The same men who had swung fists the night before were sharing tools or trading tobacco by sunrise. Out here, there was no room for long feuds. The forest demanded cooperation. Amid the roughness, there were acts of quiet kindness that went unseen. A man would patch another's torn coat without being asked. Someone would share a letter from home aloud, letting everyone pretend they'd received their own. When supplies ran low, they rationed together. Even the foreman, often feared during the days, often by the firelight, telling tales of his younger years in camps long gone. Those moments stitched the men together in a web of memory and mutual respect. Outside, the wilderness pressed in on all sides, dark, immense, and indifferent. Wolves howled in the distance. The trees creaked like old ships in the wind. The snow buried everything, even the tracks that led home. But inside that single-room cabin, human voices defied the silence of the forest. The bunkhouse became the one place in the frozen wilderness where life had warmth and sound, and in that warmth they built something stronger than any building, a sense of brotherhood forged in hardship. The Lumberjacks didn't talk about it openly. They didn't use the word brotherhood, and few would admit to needing anyone. But the truth was there in every shared meal, every mended axe, every burst of laughter that cut through the cold. They had become more than workers. They were a family of survivors, bound not by blood, but by the timber and toil of the northern woods. By midwinter, the men in the bunkhouse had fallen into a rhythm that no clock could measure. Days and nights bled together beneath the weight of the cold, but inside that log shell of smoke and laughter, they had built their own world. The snow outside piled high enough to cover windows, and ice crawled along the seams of the roof. The stove burned without pause, its iron belly devouring cord after cord of wood, yet the drafts crept in regardless. They patched the gaps with moss, rags, and old newspaper, but the cold was relentless. It tested the limits of what a man could bear. Still, they endured, not just through brute strength, but through something subtler, something that only those who had shared such hardship could understand. They had discovered that survival depended as much on spirit as it did on muscle. Humor, friendship, and shared misery were the real fuel of the camp. When spirits sagged, someone always found a way to lift them again. Sometimes it was with a prank. Lumberjacks were notorious tricksters, and the bunkhouse was their stage. One night, a man might wake to find his boots frozen solid to the floorboards. Another might discover his long johns nailed to the rafters. Laughter erupted as the victim cursed and stomped about, pretending outrage. These antics kept morale alive. When the temperature dropped below 40 below, and hope froze as hard as the rivers outside. There was an unspoken rule about jokes in the camp. They had to be good-natured. Cross a line, and you'd be facing a very different kind of fight. But most men understood the balance instinctively. Humor was a way to mock their suffering, to prove they still held mastery over their situation. They couldn't control the storms or the aching cold, but they could still laugh, and in laughter there was defiance. When payday came, if it came at all, it was another moment of shared excitement. Often, wages were delayed or reduced by company deductions. The cost of food, equipment, or lodging all tallied neatly against each man's name. Yet when silver did finally jingle in their pockets, the mood in camp turned festive. Someone might sneak in a bottle, though liquor was officially banned. The men would gather around the stove, singing louder than ever, their cheeks flushed with heat and mischief. For one night, they let themselves forget the exhaustion and debt that waited beyond the firelight. The bunkhouse had its hierarchy, though it was never spoken of openly. The veterans, men who'd worked the camps for 10, even 20 years, held an unspoken authority. They were the ones who knew how to judge the weather, how to read the grain of a log, how to keep fingers and toes intact through frostbite season. Greenhorns learned fast under their watch. A clumsy move could cost lives, and the older men wasted no time drilling caution into the newcomers. But alongside the rough instruction came care. A veteran might quietly toss a spare pair of mittens to a rookie or share a few tricks for warming frozen boots by the stove without burning them. These small gestures were never acknowledged aloud, but they built trust stronger than any rule. Evenings in the bunkhouse took on different tones as winter deepened. Sometimes they were wild with laughter, other nights quiet and reflective. The men would sit in their bunks, whittling small wooden figures or carving names into the walls, a record of their existence in a world that otherwise forgot them. The log walls of some old bunkhouses, when uncovered decades later, were found covered in such marks: initials, dates, crude drawings of saws, horses, and women. It was the only legacy most of them would leave behind, carved by calloused hands under the light of a single flickering lantern. The letters from home were treasures. They came rarely, carried by teamsters who braved the frozen trails to deliver mail between remote camps. When one arrived, the bunkhouse hushed. The man would sit by the stove, turning the envelope over in his hands like something sacred. Sometimes he read it aloud, voice trembling, or sometimes he folded it quietly, storing it near his heart. Those without letters listened anyway, pretending for a few minutes that the words were meant for them too. It was in those silent moments that the Brotherhood felt strongest. Men united not by blood, but by shared distance from everyone they loved. The hardest nights came when sickness spread. Colds turned to pneumonia quickly in the damp air, and medical help was days away. The bunkhouse became a place of whispered care, someone boiling water, another making tea from pine needles or spruce tips, an old-timer mixing mustard plasters or rubbing bare grease on a man's chest. They used what little they had. Many survived through the stubborn attention of their bunkmates. Some didn't. Death, when it came, was met with solemn ritual. Work would halt for an hour or two, rare mercy in the camps, and the men would gather, hats in hand, before sending their comrade home in a crude wooden box, carried by sled down the long white road. Through such moments, a bond formed that no hardship could erase. They joked that the only way out of the bunkhouse was in spring or in a box, but beneath the dark humor lay truth. They depended on one another for survival. No one could face that wilderness alone. As the weeks passed, even the smallest comforts took on enormous meaning. A warm pair of socks, a dry blanket, a full plate of beans. These became luxuries worth bragging about. When the cook managed to bake fresh bread, the smell alone could lift spirits for days. Tobacco, too, was currency and comfort rolled into one. Men would trade work, favors, or stories for a few puffs. The shared pipe, passed hand to hand after supper, was more than habit. It was ceremony, sealing their fellowship in smoke and silence. Sometimes, to break the monotony, the men held mock contests, arm wrestling, log rolling, or story duels, where each tried to outdo the other's tale. The laughter from those nights was fierce, almost desperate, as though they were laughing not just for fun, but to remind themselves they were still alive, and perhaps they were. Out there, in the middle of nowhere, surrounded by frozen wilderness, laughter became an act of survival. Outside, the wind howled and the snow drifted endlessly. Wolves moved closer to camp, their eyes glinting from the tree line. The men heard them sometimes, padding through the dark, curious about the warmth and noise of human life. But the bunkhouse stood firm, a small island of light in a sea of white. Its chimney poured smoke into the night sky, a silent declaration that even in the harshest world, human warmth refused to die. Toward the end of winter, when supplies grew thin and tempers short, the Brotherhood was tested most. The isolation was crushing, the cold unbearable, yet somehow they found ways to keep going. They teased each other more gently, shared their dwindling rations, and took turns stoking the fire through the night. Each act of